There are mornings in early spring when the land holds its breath. The frost has not fully loosened its grip on the county roads, and the creek at the bottom of the hill still runs dark and cold between its muddy banks, and the fields to the south lie flat and pale and waiting. The sky is the color of old pewter just before the light finds it. Everything is quiet in the way that only open country can be quiet. Not empty, but full of something that hasn't spoken yet. And then you see the hill. It catches the light before anything else does, the way a south-facing slope always catches it first, the way that particular hill has always caught it, rising above the creek and the county road in a long, slow curve. Only now there is something on it that stops you, something that makes a man slow his truck on the gravel and lean forward over the steering wheel and go still. Every tree is white, not one or two, not a scatter of early bloomers catching a warm week by luck. Every tree. All 40 of them, from the oldest at the crest of the hill down to the youngest along the creek fence, every branch carrying white blossoms so thick and heavy that the trees look as if the winter has returned in a different form. Not ice, but light. Not cold, but abundance. The whole hill breathes with it. The whole hill is alive in a way that hills rarely are. In a way that this particular hill had not been in longer than most people in the county could clearly remember. They had written it off. That is the plain fact of the matter. The men at the feed store had said so over coffee. The banker who held the small note on the property had said so in polite and careful language that still meant the same thing. The younger farmer with the big operation on the flat land below, the one who drove a late-model pickup and wore his prosperity the way some men wear a new coat. He had said it plainest of all, standing at the fence line one afternoon, not even bothering to lower his voice. Dead orchard, he had said. Cut the timber, clear the land, do something useful with it. The old man's just too stubborn to admit what everyone else can already see. That was less than a year ago. The same hill, the same 40 trees, the same thin rocky soil above the same cold creek. And now this. How does a hill that everyone agreed was finished come back to look like this? How does an orchard that 2 full seasons refused to give a single useful fruit suddenly carry blossoms on every branch from the crest to the fence line? The answer starts not with the spring and not with the blossoms. It starts at a county livestock auction in late summer, with 70 birds nobody wanted, and one old man who thought he saw something in them. 2 summers back, the hill still believed in itself a little. That was the thing. It had not given up all at once. It had done what failing things often do, which is fail slowly, in ways that let you keep hoping a while longer. There had been blossoms that first bad year. A decent showing of them in late April, white and promising against the gray sky, the way apple blossoms always are, the way they make you forget winter ever happened. And then the fruit came, or tried to, sparse clusters, marble-sized and pale. Half the trees put out nothing worth mentioning. The other half gave apples that looked right from a distance and opened wrong up close, soft at the core, wormy through the flesh. The kind of fruit that makes a man stand in his own orchard, feeling like he has failed at something fundamental. He picked what he could. He did not pretend otherwise. He loaded wooden crates into the back of the old rust-patched pickup and drove them to the farm market, and came home with less than the gas had cost him. Nobody said much that year. People were polite about it the way they are polite about a man's age, his slowing step, his quieter mornings. They did not yet say the orchard was finished. They said it had a rough year. The second season took the politeness away. That summer, the creek below ran clean and full the whole way through. You could hear it from the hill on still mornings. That thin, reliable sound of water moving over stone. The sound that said the valley had not forgotten how to sustain things. But up on the south-facing slope above it, the 40 trees stood in a kind of silence that felt different from ordinary quiet. The leaf litter from the previous autumn had packed down thick between the roots, sodden through winter, and then baked through summer into something almost like a crust. The soil underneath it had gone tight. You could push a boot heel into the ground at the base of one of those old heritage trees and feel resistance almost immediately. Compacted earth, the kind that has not been moved or breathed through in too many seasons, the kind that takes water in slowly and releases it reluctantly, as though the ground itself had grown cautious. The trees felt it. A tree will not tell you in words when its roots are suffocating, but it tells you in fruit, or in the absence of fruit. The older trees in the upper rows produced nothing that second year. Not poor fruit, not small fruit, nothing. The younger trees at the lower edge of the orchard tried and gave a scattering of apples so riddled with the marks of codling moth, so riddled through with the fine dark trails left by larvae tunneling from skin to core, that even the veteran did not pretend they were worth the crating. He stood at the edge of the hill that August and looked down at the creek, and the creek told him nothing he did not already know. Word travels fast in a small county when there is something worth saying, and the sight of a man standing at the edge of a failing orchard in August, not weeping, not cursing, just standing, the way a man stands when he is measuring a problem against something inside himself. That kind of sight gets described at the feed store, and at the diner, and across back fences, until it becomes a story that belongs to the whole town rather than to the man it happened to. The banker came out to the farm in September. He drove a clean sedan, parked it carefully on the gravel, and walked the orchard rows with his hands clasped behind his back, the way men walk when they have already formed their conclusions and are simply gathering evidence to support them. He was not unkind. He spoke in the careful, measured language of a man who considers himself practical, which is sometimes the most discouraging language in the world. The trees were spent, he said. The soil was exhausted. The orchard had given what it had to give. The smart move, and he used that word, smart, with a kind of gentle emphasis, as though smartness were a medicine being offered to someone too proud to swallow it. The smart move was timber. Cut the mature trees, sell the lumber, clear the hill, lease the slope for pasture. At minimum, he said, stop putting good money against a failing proposition. The men at the feed store said much the same thing, in rougher language and with less patience. They had seen orchards go before. They knew what spent soil looked like. The veteran came in for supplies now and then, and the conversation always found its way to the hill, to those 40 trees standing quiet and bare against the late summer sky. And the consensus was consistent and firm and delivered with the comfortable authority of people who have never been wrong about anything they chose not to attempt. But it was the younger farmer on the flat land below who said it in the way that traveled furthest. He farmed a broader spread than the veteran's hill, flatter land, better equipment, a newer tractor that ran clean and loud on diesel, and left straight furrows that could be seen from the county road. He had confidence the way some men have it in their 30s, as a kind of natural weather, something they move through without noticing. He stopped his truck at the fence line one afternoon in late September, engine idling, and looked up at the orchard on the slope above him. He took his time with it, the way a man does when he wants his silence to carry weight before he speaks. Then he said it plainly. Those trees were finished. A man who knew land could see it from the road. He drove on. The engine sound faded into the county quiet. But the words stayed, the way a stone stays after the water has moved past it. By the following week, the whole town had heard them. The auction yard smelled the way it always did in late August. Dust and animal heat, and the sharp ammonia note that soaked into the wood of old pens until no amount of weather could wash it out. The veteran had been to this yard dozens of times over the years, had walked its gravel paths in better seasons when he was buying for a fuller farm, and the familiarity of it sat on him the way familiar things do when a life has narrowed, not unpleasant, but edged with something quiet. He had not come for cattle. He had not come for hogs. He had parked the rust-patched truck along the far fence where the shade from an old hackberry tree fell just wide enough to cover the hood, and he had walked the yard with no particular hurry, the way a man walks when he is not trying to arrive anywhere, but when he is trying to see. It was the sound that pulled him down to the far end, a low, rolling percussion of gobbles and shuffling weight, the kind of noise that fills a pen like water fills a low place. He came around the last row of temporary fencing and stopped. 70 broad-breasted bronze turkeys moved in the pen like one complicated creature, their feathers catching the late morning light with a dark iridescence that shifted between copper and black, depending on how they turned. They were not pretty in the way that draws a crowd. They were heavy, plain, loud, and absolutely unwanted. The auctioneer had already made his feelings known through his pacing. He had lingered 2 pens back, working the crowd with energy and motion, and then he had slowed perceptibly as he reached the turkeys, the way a man slows when he approaches something he expects to conclude quickly and without ceremony. The price he opened with was low. The room did not respond. The veteran stood at the rail and studied them. He did not look at them the way a man looks at animals he intends to eat. He looked at them the way he looked at soil he was trying to read, slowly, with full attention, checking weight and movement, and something less definable than either. He watched how their feet worked the ground beneath them, the constant scratch and turn of claws, involuntary, industrious, as natural as breathing. He watched the density of them, 70 bodies in a space that had them pressing and shifting, all that scratching, all that movement, all that weight, coming down again and again on the same narrow earth. He stood at the rail for a long time. The auctioneer dropped the opening price again. A man near the back laughed once, short and dry. The veteran did not look up. He was watching the feet. He was watching the soil where the feet had already been working for however many days these birds had stood in this pen, the way it had loosened, turned, darkened slightly from what the birds left behind. He raised his hand. He raised his hand, and the thing was done. The loading took the better part of an hour. 2 auction hands worked the crates, while the veteran stood at the tailgate of his truck and watched each one go in. 70 birds, wooden slats, wire latch, the low churning sound of bodies adjusting inside each crate as it was lifted and stacked. His truck sat lower with every crate that went in. The suspension sagged on the old frame, and the rear tires pressed wider against the gravel. A man by the fence watched the loading and shook his head slowly, the way men do when they feel something is happening that shouldn't be, but isn't theirs to stop. The veteran paid at the booth window, paper receipt. He folded it once and put it in his breast pocket without looking at it. The drive home took him out past the county road, north where the flatland started giving way to rolling ground, then up the long gravel track that climbed his hill. The truck labored, the crates shifted, and the birds made their sounds. Not panic exactly, but the continuous low complaint of creatures that did not understand stillness or transport or what came next. He drove slowly. He had always driven slowly on this track, even before the truck got old. The orchard gate stood at the high side of the hill, where the ground leveled briefly before the first row of trees. He had hung that gate himself, a long time ago, on posts he'd set in concrete, because he had wanted things to last. He pulled the truck alongside it, and cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence. Not quite silence, the birds. He got down from the cab and opened the gate, hooking it back against the fence post. Then he started working the crates, sliding them to the tailgate one at a time, unhooking each wire latch. He did not herd the birds or coax them. He simply opened the doors. They came out the way water finds a low place. Not all at once, not in a rush, but steadily, inevitably, as if the direction had always been obvious. They spread into the first row, and then further, moving between the trunks, heads dropping to the leaf litter, almost before they had fully found their footing. The scratching began immediately. That same motion he had watched in the auction pen. Claws working the ground, turning it, probing it. The motion so automatic it seemed less like behavior than like mechanism, like something the birds could not help but do wherever their feet touched earth. The hill filled with sound, rustling, scratching, low hollow calls moving back through the rows. 2 years of silence, and now this. 70 bodies spread through 40 trees, already working. The veteran leaned against the gatepost and watched them go. The oldest tree stood near the center of the orchard. A bird had already reached it, already had its head down at the roots. It did not take long. By the second morning, a truck had slowed on the county road. A neighbor from the east side of the hill. A man with a hay operation, and opinions he never kept to himself. He sat with his window down and watched the turkeys moving between the trees for perhaps a full minute. Then he drove on. By afternoon, the feed store in town had the first version of the story. The way it was told there, the veteran had spent good money, real money, the kind a struggling farm could not afford to waste, on 70 unwanted birds nobody else had wanted, and turned them loose in an orchard that everyone with eyes could see was already past saving. The punchline was the same every time it was told. He was trying to fix dead wood with turkey manure. The men leaning against the counter thought that was about right. The younger farmer from the flatland heard the story at the feed store and told a better version of it at the diner 2 days later. He had the volume and the timing for it. A broad man with a late-model pickup, and the particular confidence of someone who had never watched a good season turn bad. He described the hill, described the trees, described the birds scratching around in the leaf rot, like they were doing anything useful. The table laughed. The waitress smiled politely. He told it again to a different table before he left. By the end of that first week, the hill had a reputation. People slowed on the county road, the way they slow past a yard sale or an accident. Not stopping, just looking, just confirming that the thing was as strange as reported. Some of them had not thought about that orchard in years. Now it was interesting in a new way, the way foolish things become interesting. The sound carried on still mornings, the low, hollow calls, the constant scratching, and if the wind was right, you could hear it from the road, which only added to the comedy of it. The words that circulated were consistent. Foolish came up most often. Wasteful was close behind. A few people were kinder and settled on embarrassing, as if the real problem was not the money or the birds, but the spectacle of an old man refusing to accept what the land had already decided. There was something uncomfortable in that for people who knew him, something they preferred to cover quickly with laughter. He did not come to town often. When he did, for feed, for wire staples, for the occasional part from the hardware, the conversations around him shifted or quieted in the way conversations do when someone has become a subject. He did not appear to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He paid for what he needed, loaded it in the rust-patched truck, and drove back up the county road toward the hill where the turkeys were still working. Summer moved on around him. Autumn came the way it always does in that country. Not announced but already present one morning, when the light changed angle and the shadows of the fence posts stretched longer across the road. The maples along the creek line went first, then the oaks on the ridge, and by mid-October the hill had turned into something almost beautiful, the kind of scene that might have been painted on a calendar if the barn had been newer and the truck less rusted. But it was beautiful anyway, in its own stubborn way, and the man who lived there seemed to know it. The turkeys moved through the fallen leaves in long, wandering lines, unhurried, methodical in the way that animals are methodical when no one has taught them to be otherwise. They worked the ground beneath each tree in slow arcs, turning the damp brown mat of leaves with their feet, pausing, moving on. From a distance they looked like a single dark current, drifting through the rows, pooling briefly under one tree before flowing toward the next. The scratching sound, That constant dry shuffling that had drawn so many comments through the summer, softened now, under the weight of the fallen leaves, became less conspicuous, less available as entertainment. People had mostly moved on to other subjects. He watched them from the porch each evening, as the light dropped behind the ridge. He had an old wooden chair out there, its back worn smooth by years of the same posture, and he would sit in it with his hands resting open on his knees, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just watching the hill in the fading light. There was no anxiety in his posture, no impatience. The kind of stillness he carried was the kind that is not emptiness, but its opposite. A fullness that has no need to move. A knowing that waits because it can afford to wait. Because it has waited before, through things that made a silent orchard and a town's mockery seem minor by any honest measure. The soil beneath the trees was barely visible through the leaf cover, but it was changing. A man who bent close to the earth, which he did, some mornings, crouching slowly on old knees at the base of one tree or another, pressing 2 fingers into the loosened ground, could feel something different about it. A give that had not been there, a darkness and moisture that spoke of activity below the surface, of root systems meeting something they had not been offered in a long time. He said nothing about this to anyone. He simply noted it the way a careful man notes things, quietly, without conclusion, storing the observation alongside the others. November came. The leaves finished falling. The turkeys moved across bare gray ground now, their shapes more visible against the pale soil, and the steam of their breath rose in faint columns on the cold mornings. The orchard stood around them, 40 trees stripped and silent, still waiting, still there. The first frost came without announcement, the way cold always does in that country. A morning that looked like the others, until you stepped outside and felt the air sharp against the back of your throat. The ground along the fence line had stiffened. The puddles at the gate had turned white-edged and still. The turkeys moved more slowly in it, picking their way across the orchard floor, with that measured, deliberate quality that cold gives to living things, as though each step required a small renegotiation with the earth. He let them out from the pen as usual, lifted the latch without ceremony, and stood back while they filed through, heads bobbing, shapes rising briefly in the gray morning light, before spreading out among the trees. He watched them for a moment, the way he had learned to watch things, not with expectation, not with impatience, simply with attention. And then he pulled his jacket collar up and began his walk. The leaf litter was nearly gone. That was the fact that struck him first, though he had been watching it go gradually for weeks. What had covered the orchard floor in October, that deep, pale, rustling carpet of fallen leaves that had also been, invisibly, a nursery for the things killing his trees, had been worked down to almost nothing. The turkeys had scratched through it methodically, not with purpose but with appetite, and what they had left behind was something different entirely. The ground looked darker, not wet, not disturbed in a careless way, but broken open, aerated along the root zones in a way that compacted clay soil never opens on its own. Back in August, when he had first walked these same rows, the earth near the base of each tree had been crusted and hard, the kind of ground that sheds water instead of receiving it, that closes itself to roots instead of offering passage. That ground was gone now. What replaced it was looser, darker, crossed with the small channel marks of turkey feet, and rich with what 70 birds had been depositing across 7 months of slow, indifferent generosity. He stopped beside one of the older trees near the center of the row, a tree that had given him nothing in 2 full seasons, and pressed the toe of his boot into the soil at its base. It gave, not softly, not like loose sand, but with that particular resistance and yield that healthy working ground has, the give of soil that has life moving through it, that has been fed and opened and invited to do its work again. He pressed once more, shifted his weight, felt the same response. He moved on. No word, no gesture, no pause beyond what the observation required. Just a note added to the others, filed carefully in the place where such things were stored, the place that had room for patience, for evidence gathered slowly, for the kind of knowing that does not need to be spoken to be certain. The second frost came 3 nights later, and the ground held what it had become. The cold arrived without announcement, the way cold always does on that hill, not in a single hard freeze, but in a slow withdrawal of warmth, degree by degree, until one morning the water in the outdoor trough wore a thin skin of ice, and the breath of 70 turkeys rose in small pale clouds above the orchard rows. By then the birds had settled into their winter pattern without being directed toward it. Each morning, when the barn doors were opened, they moved out into the rows the same way water moves downhill, not hurried, not confused, simply following the logic of habit and warmth. They worked the leaf litter where it remained, turned the exposed soil where the snow had not yet come, and stood in their broad, unhurried clusters beneath branches that held nothing, offered nothing, and were asked to offer nothing yet. Snow came for the first time in December. Not a heavy snow, a quiet one, the kind that fills the air slowly and settles over everything, with a patience that feels almost deliberate. It covered the orchard floor, filled the small channels, scratched into the surface soil, and lay across the branches in thin white lines. The hill went still under it. The turkeys retreated to the barn without being told, and the farm became a place of almost no sound at all. He tended what needed tending. Water twice a day, feed in the morning. The barn doors opened and closed. His boots left the same marks in the same order, across the same ground each day. The path worn into habit the way all necessary paths eventually are. There was no urgency in any of it. The work was what the work was, and he did it. Down on the flatland below the hill, the younger farmers' fields lay stripped and flat, the soil turned over in long mechanical furrows that ran edge to edge in neat, efficient lines. Nothing grew there. Nothing was meant to grow there yet. The geometry of it was clean and certain, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you have planted and exactly what you expect in return. There was nothing left to chance on those fields. There was nothing left that had not been accounted for. The hill looked different from the county road. The orchard sat beneath its snow, branches bare, the whole south-facing slope unremarkable to anyone passing at speed. There were no signs of what had been happening in the soil beneath all that white. There was nothing to see that would cause a person to slow down, to look twice, to wonder. The snow melted, more came. The turkeys returned each morning to the rows and stood in the cold, and were, without knowing it, still finishing something they had started in late summer. Beneath them, in the dark, the roots were holding what they had been given. The cold was still full in the air when he first saw it. He would not have seen it at all if he had not been walking the rows the way he always walked them, slowly, before the light finished coming up, before the sky had decided what color it meant to be. The hill was gray and quiet. His breath came out in small clouds and disappeared. The turkeys moved behind him at a distance, already beginning their morning work between the rows, their footsteps soft in the crusted snow. He stopped at the oldest tree first, the way he always did. He did not know exactly how old it was. Old enough that the bark had gone deeply furrowed and gray. Old enough that its lowest limbs had a downward bow that spoke of decades. He had touched this tree 100 times without looking for anything in particular. This morning he looked. It was nothing. It was so close to nothing that any other man would have walked past it without a second thought. A slight swelling at the tips of certain branches. Not a bud, not yet. Not something you could point to and name. More like the branch had made up its mind about something it had not yet announced. A subtle thickening at the ends of the smallest twigs. A firmness where there had been only the dry hardness of winter wood. He did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to. He moved to the next tree, and the next, reading each one the way a man reads weather, not from one sign but from many, building a picture from small things that do not mean much alone. Not every tree showed it, but enough did. The oldest ones, the ones whose roots ran deepest into the hill, the ones that had been there long enough to have survived other hard years. Those ones were holding something in their tips that had not been there a month ago. He stood a long time at the end of one row and looked up the slope toward the crest where the snow still lay unbroken. The light was coming now, gray softening to pale. The turkeys moved somewhere behind him, patient and unhurried, still scratching at the frozen edges of things. He thought about the auction. He thought about 70 birds standing in cold wire pens, while men laughed and shook their heads. He thought about the way the feed store men had looked at each other when he loaded them onto the truck. He had been reading something then that they could not read. He was reading something now that no one else would come looking for. He finished the last row and walked back toward the house in the early light. He told no one what he had seen. The land was not ready to be spoken about yet. It was still deciding. The cold did not leave all at once. It retreated, the way it always did on that hill, slowly, grudgingly, pulling back from the south-facing slope a little more each morning, while the north side of the fence stayed iron-hard for another week. The creek was the first thing to change. It had run quiet under its skin of ice all winter, and then one morning in early March, it spoke again, a low murmur that carried up through the bare trees like something remembering how to breathe. He heard it from the porch before first light. He stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand, and listened to the water, and did not move for a long time. The turkeys were already moving below the hill, their sounds drifting up through the gray air, unhurried as always, as though they had never once questioned the arrangement. They had eaten through the whole of the cold season without complaint. They had scratched at frozen ground on mornings when any reasonable creature would have stayed still. They had left their mark on every inch of that orchard, on every root zone, in every corner where the leaf litter had piled and packed through the years. The soil under those trees was not the same soil it had been in August. He knew it. He could see it in the texture of the turned earth near the roots, darker now, looser, alive in a way it had not been. But knowing a thing and seeing it are different kinds of truth. The blossoming came first at the crest of the hill. He almost missed it. He was walking the upper row with his hands in his jacket pockets, when something at the edge of his vision made him stop. A single branch on the oldest tree at the top of the slope, a tree with bark like cracked leather, and limbs that had gone through more winters than he could count. 3 blossoms, up white against the gray sky, so quiet they might have been snow, except the snow was gone, and these were trembling slightly in the morning air, alive in the way only living things tremble. He stood there and looked at them for a very long time. Then the second tree opened, then the third. It moved down the rows like a slow tide coming in, unhurried and enormous, white blossoms spreading from the crest toward the creek fence one tree at a time over the following days, each morning adding more until the whole hill was changed. 40 trees, every branch that had anything left in it reaching upward and opening. The birdsong was the only sound, that and the creek below finding its voice again after the long silence. He did not call anyone. He did not go into town. He walked the rows each morning alone, and let the blossoming continue without witness, as though the land needed no audience to finish what it had started. He walked the rows again on the morning the hill turned fully white. The light came in low, the way it always did in early spring, sliding across the slope at an angle that made the blossoms glow from beneath as much as above. Each tree held its flowers the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully, as though aware of what had been earned. He moved through the rows slowly, not because his knees allowed much else, but because slowness was the correct way to move through a thing like this. The orchard had taken its time. He could take his. At the top of the slope he stopped at the oldest tree. The bark was the same as it had always been, cracked and dark and thick with the memory of hard seasons. He placed one hand against it, palm flat, the way a man checks whether something is still warm. The blossoms above him were open fully now, every branch carrying white out to its farthest reach. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the tree did not already know. Below the hill, the county road ran straight along the creek flat, the way it had for as long as anyone could remember. A late model pickup from the 80s came along it at ordinary speed, and then slowed, then stopped. The engine ran. The truck did not move. From where the veteran stood he could see it, though he did not turn to face it directly. He knew the truck. He knew who was inside. He had heard the voice that had come from that cab on a summer morning in the feed store parking lot. The easy laughter, the words about turkeys and foolishness, and a man throwing good money after dead wood. He remembered it, the way a man remembers weather, not with bitterness, only with the steady accuracy of someone who was there. He did not look down. The truck stayed where it was for a long time. Long enough that a man sitting inside would have to see the whole hill, all 40 trees, the white covering every branch from the crest down to the creek fence, the orchard that had been called finished, called timber, called a waste. Long enough for silence to become its own kind of answer. Then the truck moved on down the road and was gone. The veteran kept his hand against the bark a moment longer. Then he let it fall. He turned and walked back down through the rows the way he had come, past each tree in its white and unhurried bloom, past the fence where the creek murmured below, past the quiet garden near the house where the ground was already beginning to soften. The hill held its blossoms against the pale sky, wide and still, the way it had begun, the way, if a man was patient enough, most good things eventually returned.